So let's also talk a bit about what are called life history strategies. Darwinian fitness is calculated as the number of offspring an organism leaves behind that go on to reproduce themselves. Really, in biology or in evolution, getting as many copies of your genes to the next generation is really the only goal of life. So organisms use these things called life history strategies to achieve this goal of passing on their genes to the next generation. These strategies have been shaped dramatically by natural selection. So a definition for a life history strategy is an age and stage specific pattern of the timing of events in life. Things like birth, weaning, maturation, and death are all parts of these strategies. So in AP Biology, we're going to talk mainly about two types of life history strategies. One of those is called R selection, and the other is called K selection. So let's start with R selection. The little r here stands for reproduction. The general strategy of organisms that follow R selection is to produce as many offspring as possible and hope that some of them survive and reproduce and pass on those genes to the next generation. These species put a very small investment of resources into each offspring. They provide very little parental care, very little effort to ensuring that each individual baby survives. They're not generally very invested in, again, protecting the young. Often, the eggs are fertilized and then dispersed, and the parent has no other contact with the babies. The benefit of this strategy is that it works to ensure that reproduction happens even if resources are limited and unpredictable. Each individual is very likely to die early, but because these organisms produce so many individual offspring, some of them make it to the next generation. This type of life history strategy tends to work in environments that are less competitive, sort of low quality, unstable environments. Typically, our selected strategies are used by smaller animals with shorter lifespans. Things like fish, insects tend to exhibit this kind of strategy. The young tend to be born and then mature very rapidly. That's called precocial. They develop early independence. Our selected species tend to follow a type 3 survivorship curve, which again means that most of them die right after birth or maybe even before birth. A few live on to maximum life expectancy. So it's a type 3. Oftentimes they'll exhibit exponential growth. So we'll see if we're looking at population size graphed against time, you'll get this big J-shaped exponential growth curve. Oftentimes that's followed by a period of rapid death. So again, that's R selection. Now let's also talk a bit about K selection. So K refers here to carrying capacity. And what this means is that the offspring from K-selected organisms are entering into an environment that's competitive. It's in a population that's near the carrying capacity. K-selected organisms and K-selected strategies, they tend toward putting a heavy investment into each offspring. Typically, these organisms don't make a whole lot of babies, but they provide a lot of parental care and effort into making sure that those babies survive. This strategy tends to be common in organisms that are larger and in organisms that have pretty long life expectancies. The babies tend to be born fairly immature, and it takes quite a while for them to grow up. Again, heavy parental care and nurturing, lots of time devoted to teaching the offspring, fierce protection of the babies. These babies have a high probability of survival and making it to maturity. Like I said earlier, it's not always true, but typically these organisms are larger animals like whales and elephants and humans that have longer lifespans. The generations overlap, they're alive at the same time. K selection typically is found in environments that are pretty stable. And organisms that are K selected typically follow a type 1 survivorship curve and oftentimes they exhibit logistic growth. What that means, if we graph population size against time, so the population reaches carrying capacity, and then it may oscillate around the carrying capacity slightly. So those are K-selected species. It's important to note that R and K selection are two extreme sides of this life history strategy, and that most things are probably somewhere in the middle.